Hi, everybody. Welcome to this week's lecture. Today, for this lecture, we're going to be talking about culture, conflict, and anxiety, which are the readings for week 5. I'm just going to go over some main concepts from the 3 readings. Nothing too elaborate. I know there was a lot of content going on in those readings, but I think it connects us really well to what we're then talking about in week 6 when it comes to inclusive leadership. So let's go ahead and get started. I thought it was relevant in the Chang article that he brings in Collier and Thomas in this idea of cultural identity, right? And their definition is the identification with and perceived acceptance into a group that has shared systems of symbols and meanings, as well as norms and rules for conduct. Now, Chang starts with this citation, and then gets in this idea of individuality and culture. And I think it's important because oftentimes when we're put in a leadership position, we're in charge of a number of different people, right? And those people come from a variety of different cultures. The problem is there are a lot of leaders who tend to kind of put the culture of an individual and make that representative of that individual, right? And the other problem is that we are comprised of a number of different cultures. There's this tendency for people to kind of conflate race and culture, right? That those two are synonymous, and they're not, right? Culture could be it could be age related, it could be race related, it could be religion related. There could be subcultures within music. There could be cultures within a number of different areas of life, and those all come together to make up the culture and or cultures that a number of people, ascribe to or are a part of. And I think it's important to understand that as we head into this idea of inclusive leadership, to know that we're not just grabbing or thinking about what we know, the little, but sometimes often the little that we know as leaders of someone's culture, and putting all of that onto the individual. So let's keep moving forward. In his article, Chang argues that there is a neglect of individuality, right? That there are too many people that are treating culture, and it could even be organizational culture, as like the one all be all when it comes to dealing with the people that we work with, or if you're in a leadership position, the people that we're supposed to be leading. He argues that culture and individuality mutually influence each other, right? So the individual is very much obviously a part of that culture, but that culture is going to inform the individual, and that individual is inherently going to influence the culture, especially when you think about the workplace culture that someone is trying to build up and create and maintain. And these last 2 points are really important, right? So culture is not a uniform, static notion. And we're seeing that play out, kind of in politics and pop culture, where people are coming to this realization that there have been people that are being treated a particular way for centuries, for hundreds of years, because there are uniform, static notions of what culture are about, or what race is all about, or what ethnicity, or what sexuality. Like, there are people who are ascribing or who are thinking about culture in a static way, in a uniform, just one, there's only one way of thinking about this particular group of people, which we all know is just inherently wrong, right? It's just impossible even to think about people in your own family, right? Like, if let's say you're part of a nuclear family that has 4 individuals in it, those 4 individuals, even though they're in the same household and oftentimes following the same prescribed like patterns and behaviors and often schedules, like, they are all very different people. Even when you look at like twins in a family, like, there are very distinct, unique personalities. And yet when we get into the workplace, or when we get into social environments, there's this tendency for some folks to think that this one person is part of this particular culture, and that means they are X, Y, and Z, because this is what I know of that culture. But culture itself is not static. It is always and forever changing. And the second point here is that communication by individuals enacts and transforms culture, right? So the different nonverbal and verbal behaviors and actions of individuals is going to transform culture. And I think that really segues nicely into the next article that we read on uncertainty and anxiety with Goody-Kunz and Nishida. So obviously we understand that there's some degree of uncertainty that exists in all relationships, right? But there is more uncertainty when we communicate with members of different groups than when we communicate with members of our own groups, right? And so knowing that, right, what did we just cover, right? That we are dealing as leaders and even just as team members, right? Because oftentimes we're in these we are hoping and aspiring to be leaders at some point, and I'm sure many of us have like witnessed this type of behavior from some leaders that we may not be very fond of, but we have seen people in leadership positions treat others based on this idea that culture is uniform or static. But that being said, when we're dealing with people we don't know, our anxiety goes up a little bit, right? And we don't have to think about anxiety in terms of like the physical manifestation, but just in general, like whatever idea of anxiety whatever small, I should say, not form, but whatever amount of anxiety that you typically would feel in terms of like a communication exchange and a working relationship, that all changes when you're dealing with someone who's not a part of your own kind of in group. So anxiety, the thing to think about is anxiety is often based off of negative expectations, which again goes back to what we were just talking about, where oftentimes we are putting our own thoughts and opinions on individuals and cultures and people around us. Right? Stephen and Stephen in 1985, they talked about the fact that we often fear negative consequences for our self-concepts, negative behavior consequences, negative evaluations by others, and negative evaluations by members of our in-group. So all of those things in turn even amplify that anxiety that we may have, especially if you think about the in-group that you have established in the workplace. Like all of those different things are going to just amplify that idea of anxiety. Now, what Goody-Kuntz and Nishida argue is that there is a moderate negative relationship between anxiety and attributional confidence, which is the opposite of uncertainty. So essentially, they're saying that there is a pretty strong relationship and it's a negative relationship. That means as anxiety goes up, then your attributional confidence goes down, which means there's a positive relationship between anxiety and uncertainty. So as anxiety goes up, uncertainty goes up as well. Anxiety negatively predicts effectiveness, and attributional confidence positively predicts perceived effectiveness across relationships and cultures. So the more confident you are with the people around you, it will oftentimes lead to better effectiveness across relationships and cultures, right? But that can only happen by getting to know the people that you're working with. Right? They don't necessarily have to become part of your in-group, although that's the ideal, right? That's what we're working towards. And as you've noticed, and as we get into this idea of inclusive leadership, that only happens. Inclusive leadership only happens when you create the environment and create the space for that inclusive relationship, right? And especially in the border, when you're thinking about where we are here, there are often times where things are kind of flipped on their head here, where a lot of folks that are in leadership positions are minorities. Right. And, myself included, when you're in a leadership position, you are oftentimes dealing with the same people. Right. And so you have that familiarity, you have that lack of uncertainty, because there are some, while culture is not static and it's not uniform, there are some familiar connections that you can make with other people that are part of your culture. And so oftentimes you are the ones that are having to adapt to people that come into El Paso or come into whatever border city that you live in, and having to make adaptations that you aren't necessarily accustomed to, because maybe it's Spanglish that you're used to using with the people around you, because again, that's the language of familiarity that you have. And so whether you are someone who is Latinx, who is already living on the border and a leader in the border, or whether you are someone who is moving into El Paso or moving into the border and becoming a leader, or getting into a leadership position, your responsibility then is to lower that uncertainty and to lower that anxiety to prevent the uncertainty. Okay? That leads into this idea of conflict style, right? So there's this nice chart here from the reading, right? In terms of like, when you're concerned for others here on the left, you're concerned about your own outcomes is here on the right. And here are the different conflict styles that you could potentially have or utilize, right? There's obliging if you're just completely concerned about other people and not necessarily yourself. There's completely avoiding if you're not concerned about yourself or the other person. There's compromising in the middle, dominating on the far right on the bottom if you're just concerned about your own outcome. And then if you're concerned with both on the far top right, I should say, is integrating. Now, most people, when they start thinking about conflict styles, the first thing they want to think about is compromising, right? The problem with compromising is often it means that everyone is losing a little bit, right? People like framing it as like, well, we all win, but that's not necessarily the case. Typically, when you're compromising, everybody has to lose a little bit here, so make some concessions in order for some folks to leave not upset, and that's not ideal. Ideally, what you want to do is integrating, and what that means is kind of leaving this invitation open to come to the table, bring ideas together, and maybe there are some solutions that we haven't even thought about that could make everybody happy, right? Including as many ideas as possible and as many voices as possible. Now, what these authors looked at is the different cultural backgrounds in terms of individualists and collectivists, right? And individualist cultures and collectivist cultures, right? So avoiding was preferred by individualists, right? Not necessarily. So that goes to show that if you're just thinking about kind of yourself, if individualists, you're not necessarily too concerned about kind of like the group mentality, you often preferred avoiding as in terms of your conflict style. Whereas collectivists preferred compromising and integrating more than individualists, and conflict styles are highly multidimensional for both individualists and collectivists. And the biggest thing that I thought that was important for this reading was that the meaning of the 4 of the 5 styles, aside from dominating, is different for individualists and collectivists. So even when we're talking about integrating or compromising or avoiding, all of those, aside from dominating, mean something different when you're coming from an individualistic culture or a collectivistic culture, right? And so even that can cause some confusion. And so what does this all mean in terms of these readings put together? So leaders often conflate culture with identity, and they often conflate cultures, right? You see this all the time when you see people who think that all Black people are representative of each other, right? When you think about there's African Americans, there are Black Haitians, Black Puerto Ricans, there are Jamaicans. Like those are a variety of different cultures, but people just say, well, those people are Black, so they must X, Y, and Z. Same thing goes for folks who are Latinx, right? People don't make distinctions between Mexican and Puerto Rican and Cuban, and oftentimes, depending on where you are, you might be ascribed a particular identity just based on the location, right? So leaders often make that mistake of assuming when they're simply just looking by the color of someone's skin, right? So from there, we go into this idea that there's a strong connection between uncertainty and anxiety goes up when we communicate with people outside our in-group, and individualists and collectivists prefer collaboration and integration, but the definition of conflict styles differs between the two groups. So all of this comes together, right, where we are talking about the need to focus on not just the culture, but also taking into consider individuality. How crucial it is to take the time to know our team, get to know our team, create an environment where communication is normalized, right? We're getting to know each other and conversating is normalized and prioritized in your organization, right? From there, you're reducing anxiety and you're reducing uncertainty. And then from there, you are more likely to be in a good position for compromising. And if you really do lead with inclusive leadership, as we're going to get to in the next reading, a lot more integrating than any of the other conflict styles. So that's how this is the reason why I paired these or put these 3 readings together, was because of that natural progression of understanding that individuals are not representative of their culture and vice versa, right? There are a number of things that you have to consider when dealing with your team and with your coworkers and your colleagues. And only by getting to know them can you get to a point where you're reducing anxiety and uncertainty. And then from there, you're avoiding or creating conflict. Because conflict is good, right? I think when people hear conflict, they think it's automatically this bad thing. But conflict can also lead to brilliant ideas and progress and momentum and more than anything, understanding. And I think that's key, is getting into these conflicts where you allow yourself to get into a conflict to where you get to know your team just a little bit better. So that is the week 5 readings and the lecture for week 5.